Så da tenker jeg at vi klar. Hi everyone, we are getting ready to get started again. It's really good to see you all, as it always is. Today I have Sturla Stålsett with me here. He's a professor here at MF of Diaconal Studies, Religion and Society. And he is here today to present his new book, which you see here, and there are a couple of them over there. So please feel free to pick it up and have a look. And the title of the book is A Political Theology of Vulnerability. And it was recently published, like very recently published, right? By Bill.
I got it in the mail 3 weeks ago. So.
Yeah, that's recently.
Yeah.
Yes. So let me just say a little bit about what MF CASR book talks is before we move on. So the book talks are there to enable you to celebrate a new publication, to note it, to promote your book, and also to present your book for your colleagues. And they can have different formats. It can be a presentation as the one we have today, like a simple presentation. You can invite a respondent if you like, and then have like 15 more minutes. Or you can have like a celebration, like cake type, which is also possible if that is what you wish. So just be in touch with me if you are publishing a book and you want to present it here at MF CASR. So since today we are just having a simple presentation, we stick to the 30 minutes format, which you already know, with the 13 minutes for presentation and the 13 minutes for the Q&A and discussion. And if you're with us on Zoom, you can put questions if you have them in the chat function or the Q&A function. Please, Sturla, your turn.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for being here. Sorry about, of course, now you think, oh, there's no cake. So this is not a celebration then. And even sunny outside, and I'm dragging you in, so sorry about that. But thank you for coming. And it is, of course, a joy to present a result of a long journey. For fun, I was asking GPT, what is a political theology of vulnerability last week, and I was very happy to see it. It just went spinning, and then it said, "This takes a bit longer than expected." So I'm a bit ahead of it, but I don't think it will last for long. Although this book has also taken a long time. In some senses, it started already back in 98, 99, I was on a commission of the Church of Norway on international affairs, and we worked on all the political developments, international crisis during the 90s, the optimism after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the pessimism with the genocide in Rwanda and all the security issues there. And we started to in the commission, we started to think about, is really vulnerability the opposite of security? And we made this booklet. And I'm proud to say that this was even prior to 9/11, because after 9/11, the issue of vulnerability, and Judith Butler, whom I'm using a lot in this book, used this. And Hans Morten was part of who's arriving there of this. And we republished it later on as Vulnerability and Security. So my interest in the very basic idea of vulnerability started then, but it came also through my work, my doctoral work on liberation theology and the theology of the cross, which is of course about vulnerability and strength, liberation and loss, and that dynamic has followed me through lots of my work, both in diaconal practice, political engagement, and not least in theology. So when this book is now out, it's in this book I draw on that long time journey experience of my own, struggling with the significance of human vulnerability and what it means in theological terms, ethical terms, and political terms. Here, what I do with this book is to frame that, to try to not sum it up, but to put it into reflection on what political theology can do and is doing with the concept of vulnerability, in particular applied to two struggles or conundrums within political critical theory and practice, namely how to build a political community and how to enforce, mobilize political agency. And particularly from the point of view of people, communities struggling with poverty, with wars, with crisis, those issues of how to build an inclusive and liberating community and how to move and inspire political agency, I find to be very, very critical. And I suspect that's the start of the book, in some sense, that in the many crises of political community and agency, there is the experience and phenomenon and conceptualization of vulnerability lurking. There's a handout, so you can look at the table of contents. The book, what I'm trying to do is to ask the question, in what ways could a different conceptualization of vulnerability affect, for good, for better, political agency and political community? And that's the first question. And the second question is, what key resources do religions, but not religions in a wide sense here, in particular the Christian traditions, offer to frame vulnerability differently in a way that could enforce and mobilize a different kind of political agency? And the main idea is that vulnerability is what I call the conventional approach, that vulnerability is a problem, is a weakness, is a limitation, is something to be reduced or ideally eliminated. That is the conventional conceptualization of vulnerability. But at least since 9/11 in political theory, and but after that also, and in different studies and different disciplines, a different kind of idea of vulnerability has emerged, namely to see vulnerability as not only constitutive of the human condition as such, but constitutive of ethical action and of political resistance and liberation. So it's coming from critical theory, political theory, feminist theory, climate studies, and in many fields, you have this reframing of vulnerability. So in the first part of the book, I try to go through some of, admittedly, very critical political theories that I've selected to look at how vulnerability is at the core of some of the main themes that they're struggling with. So I go through Guy Standing and the precariat. I discuss Hart and Negri and the multitude, and Agamben and bare life and the state of emergency. And I moved to a very interesting Italian political philosopher whom I didn't know before, but I've worked with him, which he works on the issue of community and immunity, as seeing the interrelationship between these. And then lastly, but not least, Achille Mbembe, who we had here in the MF CASR annual lecture 2 years ago, was it? Mm-hmm. From Cameroon, to give a post-colonial approach to this. Then I use, not least, Judith Butler and feminist ethical theory, and also theological resources in that part, to sketch a different affirmative anatomy, we could call it, of vulnerability. So that's the second part, or the third chapter here, reconsidering vulnerability. Having done that, proposing that there is, in a different framing of vulnerability, a possibility for a more inclusive political community and a more committed political agency from the point of view of marginalized or people struggling with oppression in different ways, I moved to what role could religion play in that kind of situations and with that kind of question and challenge. And then there's a chapter which is more, in one sense, it's more of a sociology of religion. It asks, what is the role of religion in precarious times and precarious situations? And it discusses with political scientists Engelhardt and Norris, who reframes the secularization theory as not dealing primarily with secularization as product of modernization, but they reframe it as secularization is a product of the lack of human security. In other words, vulnerability. So I discussed their approach before I move on to the real theological part of it, which is the two last chapters, in which I try not to use the traditional way of doing systematic theology or even political theology, which would be to work with the source texts from the Bible to church fathers and Luther, and then on to our contemporary theologians, but rather try, inspired by contextual theologies and also inspired by a lived religion approach, and our colleague also Jan Olav Henriksen's approach to theology as a pragmatist in a philosophical sense, approach to life, religion as transformation, orientation, and legitimization. These approaches lead me to addressing the two main festivals of Christianity, namely Christmas and Easter, and some lived testimonies or practices of those two celebrations. One sermon of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador in 1979, Christmas sermon, which I read not to explain what it says or to show that it's an ideal sermon, but to make use of it, to reflect upon what it says about the power of vulnerability in a precarious situation. And then secondly, I use spirituals as the material from which I try to draw my political theological reflections on what the cross might say about vulnerability in those particular situations of precariousness, and what it means for political community and what it means for political agency. And two of the main ideas that I draw from that is to see the enactment of Christmas as a dispossession of divinity. That would be incarnation or kenosis, and using Butler's and a Greek philosopher, Athanasio, they use dispossession in a very critical and interesting way, relating it to vulnerability. I try to apply that to a reading of the cross, of the incarnation. And then secondly, to see the cross and the celebration of the cross and resurrection of Christ as a kind of sacralization of vulnerability. In the line of even going back to Durkheim and later on Hans Joas as sociologists of religion, using the concept of sacralization. And I try to use that theologically in a way of reading what goes on in Christian celebration of the cross and resurrection. I also in that part draw on trauma theology, and I noticed that Sherry Rambo will be visiting us later on this semester again. She's one of the leading voices in political theology of trauma theology, and I draw a little bit on her work as well. Finally, I'll just end with that. The political theology, what is that? It's as you can hear, it's a quite interdisciplinary book. I draw on many disciplines with a lot of. I'm very vulnerable in that situation. It's risky to cross the boundaries of research. But the political theology that I work with here is drawing on it's noticing the Carl Schmittian tradition, which is very much philosophical and it's both challenging and provocative, which says that in all political events or institutions, there are implicit ideas of theology. It's in the background, but my primary approach to political theology is the more which comes from within Christian theology, asking what kind of politics is emerging from certain kinds of reading the Christian message. So in that sense, I also draw on Gustavo Gutierrez's classical definition of liberation theology as a reflection upon praxis in light of faith in the Christian God. More or less?
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay,